Thomas Reed shoved the return ticket into her hand, in front of the whole town like she was freight he'd decided not to haul. Elizabeth Carter looked down at it. Then she looked up at him, this man she'd crossed 1,400 miles of hard country to marry, standing there in his cowboy hat and his leather vest, with his jaw set and his eyes already looking somewhere else. She pressed the ticket back against his chest. "I came here to build a life," she said. "Not to be sent back like damaged goods." The whole of Cedar Hollow held its breath. Thomas Reed didn't move, neither did she. If this story hits you somewhere deep, subscribe to our channel and ride this story all the way to the end with us. Drop a comment, tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Elizabeth Carter's story travels. The train was still exhaling steam when Elizabeth Carter stepped onto the platform at Cedar Hollow. She had been awake for 2 days straight. Not because the seats were uncomfortable, though they were. Not because the journey from Chicago to the Colorado Territory was long, though it had stretched across nearly 1,400 miles and 4 separate rail transfers. She had been awake because she was afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would lose her nerve. And if she lost her nerve, she would pull the emergency cord and ask the conductor to let her off at the next stop, wherever that happened to be. And she would walk into whatever small town appeared first and ask for any job that didn't require her to step off this train and face a stranger who had agreed, through the careful language of 4 letters, to marry her. But she had not pulled the cord. She had kept her eyes open, through the Kansas grasslands, through the long, slow climb into higher elevation, through the moment when the mountains first appeared on the horizon, like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved. And now she was here. The suitcase she carried weighed almost nothing. 1 change of dress, 1 spare pair of shoes, a small Bible that had belonged to her mother. 3 letters tied with a piece of string. The letters were from Thomas Reed, owner of the Reed Brook Cattle Ranch, outside Cedar Hollow, Colorado Territory, and she had read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She did not carry them because she was sentimental. She carried them because they were the only proof she had that someone in this world had asked for her. Cedar Hollow was watching. That was the first thing Elizabeth noticed, even before she saw Thomas Reed's face. The people on the platform, and there were more than she expected for a midday train arrival, in a frontier town, had turned almost in unison when she stepped down. Not the way people turn to look at someone beautiful or important. The way people turn to look at something that doesn't quite fit. A woman murmured something to the man beside her. Another woman touched her friend's sleeve and tilted her chin toward Elizabeth. A group of men near the water barrel stopped their conversation entirely. Elizabeth had grown up in a city. She knew what it felt like to be invisible in a crowd. She had spent most of her 25 years being invisible, moving through the busy streets of Chicago. After her parents died, working in a seamstress shop for 4 years on the same block, eating her supper alone in a room above a laundry, becoming so ordinary and so unremarkable that even the people who saw her every day could not have described her face with any accuracy. This was different. This was the opposite of invisible. This was the feeling of being examined. She kept her chin level. She adjusted the suitcase in her hand. She looked through the crowd, searching for the man whose handwriting she had memorized, whose sentences she had studied the way her mother used to study scripture, looking for truth hidden in the arrangement of plain words. She found him. Thomas Reed was standing at the edge of the platform, slightly apart from the crowd, as if he had positioned himself to be seen without having to push forward. He was taller than she had imagined from his letters. Broader through the shoulders, he wore a dark brown hat and a vest that had once been good quality and had since become merely functional. He was perhaps 40 years old, perhaps a little older. He had the kind of face that would be considered handsome in certain lights and in certain moods. In this light, in this moment, his face was not handsome. It was closed. Elizabeth walked toward him. The crowd shifted slightly. She could feel their attention tracking her movement, The way you can feel the direction of a cold wind even when you can't see it. Mr. Reed. She said his name quietly because she was not sure how much of her voice she trusted right now. Thomas Reed looked at her, and in the very first second she saw it. Not cruelty exactly, not meanness, something almost worse. Calculation. The look of a man going through a private accounting in his head, measuring what he saw against what he had expected, and finding the numbers didn't balance. He said nothing for 3 seconds. In 3 seconds, a crowd of 40 people can hold its breath. Miss Carter, his voice was flat, not unkind. Just flat in the way that flat is its own kind of unkind. I'm sorry. Elizabeth felt the words land somewhere in her chest. This arrangement, he paused. Start it again. I don't think it's going to work. The crowd was very quiet. She heard a child whisper something and get hushed immediately. Elizabeth kept looking at his face. She was trying to find the man from the letters. The one who had written, in a careful, unsteady hand, that he had been lonely for 4 years, since his first wife passed, and that he was not looking for someone perfect, only someone willing. She was looking for the man who had underlined the word willing twice, as if he thought it was more important than beautiful, or accomplished, or well-born. She couldn't find him. You decided that in 1 minute, she said. It wasn't a question, but her voice was calm. She discovered that she had a kind of stillness available to her, that she hadn't known about before this moment. As if the body, when it reaches a certain threshold of loss, stops trying to perform emotions and simply exists inside them. I've been thinking for a while, Thomas said. Since your last letter. My last letter. Elizabeth repeated the word slowly. I told you the truth in my last letter. I told you I had no family money. I told you I had no experience with cattle or ranch work. I told you exactly who I was. I know. What changed? Thomas looked away from her face. He looked somewhere over her left shoulder, at the water tower, or the mountains, or some point in the middle distance that was easier to hold his gaze. I spoke to a few people, he said. People who know this life. And the general feeling was, he stopped, tried again. A woman like you, from the city, it wouldn't last a season. A woman like me, Elizabeth said. I'm not trying to insult you. What kind of woman am I, Mr. Reed? The question hung in the air between them. Around them, the crowd had stopped pretending not to listen. There was no pretense now. Cedar Hollow was watching 2 people have the most uncomfortable conversation a person could have in public, and the town had decided, collectively, that it would not look away. Thomas reached into his coat. He produced a sealed envelope. Your return ticket, he said. I've included enough for the journey back east, and a few days' accommodation when you arrive. It should be. I don't want your money. She said it before she thought about it. Thomas looked at her. Miss Carter, I'm trying to. I know what you're trying to do. Elizabeth's voice was still quiet. Still steady. You're trying to make this easier for yourself. The envelope makes it a transaction. The ticket makes me a problem that's been solved. She looked at the envelope without touching it. Keep it. Someone in the crowd made a small sound. Not quite a gasp. The sound people make when something unexpected happens in a place where the expected was already painful. Thomas said, You have nowhere to go. That is correct. You can't stay in Cedar Hollow. Why not? He blinked. The question seemed to genuinely surprise him. Because. He looked around, as if the crowd could help him finish the sentence. Because the arrangement is finished, Elizabeth said. Yes, I understand that. You've made your decision very clearly. She picked up her suitcase. But I arrived in Cedar Hollow on a westbound train. Reed and I have not yet decided where I'm going next. I'll make that decision myself. She stepped past him. She did not run, she did not hurry. She walked away from Thomas Reed with the same pace she would have used crossing a room in ordinary circumstances. And she found a bench near the edge of the platform, and she sat down. And she set her suitcase at her feet, and she folded her hands in her lap. And she looked at the not all at once. She looked at the mountains, because they were the largest thing available, and she needed to look at something larger than herself right now. She needed to feel small in a way that wasn't humiliating. The mountains were not judging her. The mountains had been there for 10,000 years, and would be there for 10,000 more. And they had watched a great many people arrive in the Colorado Territory, with plans that didn't survive contact with reality, and they had watched those people either leave or adapt or break, and they would watch her now with the same perfect indifference. She found that comforting. She found it easier to breathe. Behind her, she could hear the crowd beginning to move, beginning to talk, the normal sound of a train platform reasserting itself. She heard Thomas Reed's boots on the wooden planks, walking away. She heard a woman say, in a voice not quite low enough, "Poor thing doesn't know what she's done." Elizabeth kept looking at the mountains. She was doing arithmetic in her head. Not about money, though she would have to think about money eventually, because the small amount she had left after the train fare would last perhaps 4 or 5 days in a boarding house, if she was careful. She was doing a different kind of arithmetic. The kind where you count up everything you have and see if it's enough. She had her hands. She had 4 years of experience with fabric and mending and domestic work. She had the ability to cook a reasonable meal from limited ingredients. She had managed her own small household since she was 16 years old, first caring for her sick father, and then, after he died, for herself. She was good with numbers. She was good with organization. She did not frighten easily, or at least she had not frightened easily before today, and she was not going to start now. She had come 1,400 miles for a life. There was still a life here somewhere. It might not be the one she had planned, ma'am. The voice came from behind her and slightly to the left, and something in its tone made her turn immediately, not because it was loud or urgent, but because it was careful. The voice of someone who had chosen the word ma'am deliberately, as a signal, a small act of courtesy delivered in advance of whatever was coming next. She turned. The man standing behind her was not part of the crowd she had noticed earlier, or if he was, she had not picked him out. He was perhaps 10 years older than her, which put him near 35, though the Colorado sun had put some of its work on his face, and he might have been younger than he looked or older. It was hard to say. He was not the tallest man on the platform or the broadest, but he stood the way certain people stand, when they have spent a long time being responsible for things squared up, balanced, as if he were always ready to move in whatever direction was needed. He held his hat in both hands in front of him. His name, she would learn, was James Walker. But she didn't know that yet. What she knew in this first moment was that he was not looking at her the way the rest of Cedar Hollow had been looking at her. The rest of the town had been watching a spectacle. This man was watching a person. "I saw what happened," he said. Elizabeth braced herself. She had been bracing herself for sympathy, which she found harder to endure than judgment, because sympathy required her to acknowledge that something pitiful had occurred, and she was not ready to do that yet. "I'm not going to tell you I'm sorry," James said. That was not what she expected. "Excuse me? Saying I'm sorry implies I had something to do with it." He held her gaze without any of the discomfort most people showed when the situation was awkward. "I didn't, so I won't apologize." A brief pause. "What I will say is that I have a ranch about 2 miles outside of town, and it's in considerably worse shape than it should be, and I'm in need of someone who can manage a household." Elizabeth looked at him. "You're offering me work." "I am. Why?" James considered the question as if it deserved consideration. "Because you're here. Because you're evidently capable, given what just happened." He glanced in the direction Thomas Reed had gone. Most people don't walk away from something like that without flinching. "You didn't flinch." "I'm flinching on the inside," Elizabeth said. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, exactly. Something quieter than a smile. "That's your business," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Cooking, managing supplies, keeping the house in order. My workers' meals. Mostly, there are 6 men on the property, and they've been feeding themselves for 4 months, which means they've been living on whatever they can figure out, over a fire, and the results are as bad as you'd imagine. He paused. I also need someone who can keep track of the books. Not large figures, but regular ones. I'm decent with cattle. I'm not decent with columns of numbers. I'm decent with columns of numbers, Elizabeth said. I suspected you might be. Why? Because you were doing them just now, he said. In your head. You were sitting here figuring something out, and it looked like arithmetic. Elizabeth stared at him. I'm not a charity case, she said. I'm not offering charity. His voice was straightforward, without edge, but also without apology. I'm offering fair wages and a room in the main house, and 3 meals a day. The work is real, the hours are long, the pay is consistent. And what does the town think of that? Elizabeth asked. Of you hiring a failed mail-order bride. James glanced toward the crowd, which had begun to drift but had not entirely dissipated, the way a crowd never entirely dissipates when there is still something happening worth watching. The town thinks a lot of things, he said. Most of them are not my concern. Elizabeth picked up her suitcase. She stood. When do I start, she said. The Walker Ranch was 2 miles out of Cedar Hollow, on a road that turned from packed dirt to softer ground as it climbed slightly toward the eastern foothills. James drove the wagon, and Elizabeth sat on the bench beside him, and neither of them spoke very much, which was a relief, because she was exhausted, and the silence felt like the first genuine kindness the day had offered. The ranch itself was, she searched for the word, she settled on honest. The buildings were solid. Someone had built them. With intention, with the specific kind of care that comes from knowing you're building something you'll have to live inside for decades. The barn was large and well-proportioned. The fences were in reasonable repair, though some sections needed attention. The main house was not large, but it was not small either, and it had a porch that faced west, toward the mountains, which meant whoever had built it had thought about sets. Had thought about the specific pleasure of watch the day finish from a fixed and comfortable point. But everything needed work. The kitchen, when Elizabeth walked through it that first afternoon, was a study in what happens when practical people stop caring about practicality. Supplies were stored without logic. Pots were stacked in combinations that made retrieving the bottom one an act of engineering. The hearth needed cleaning. The water barrel, near the back door, had developed a slow leak that had left a dark stain on the floorboards. The curtains on the single window had been pulled back so long they had lost their original position, and now hung at angles that let in the morning light but created shadows in all the wrong places in the afternoon. Elizabeth stood in the center of the kitchen for approximately 1 minute. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The 6 ranch hands found out about the new arrival in the way ranch hands always find out about anything through Samuel Hayes, the foreman, who had heard about the train platform incident from his cousin who had been in town that morning, and who had formed his conclusions in the first hour and saw no reason to revise them. City woman, he announced at supper that first night, loud enough to carry but quiet enough to maintain the fiction of a private opinion. Won't last the month. The man next to him, a younger hand named Will, looked toward the kitchen door. She cooked the potatoes right. Anyone can cook a potato. She fixed the water barrel. Samuel looked up. She found the leak in the water barrel, Will said. Fixed it herself. There's a dry floor now. Samuel said nothing more. But Elizabeth noticed, when she brought out the bread, that he ate 2 pieces without comment, and a man who is confident a woman can't do something doesn't usually eat her bread. She noticed everything. That was her particular skill. Not a talent she had cultivated intentionally, but one that had grown up around the necessity of surviving on her own. When you have no one to tell you what to watch out for, you learn to watch out for everything. You learn to read the small signals: who is tired, who is resentful, who is hungry in ways that have nothing to do with food, who needs to feel seen in a room where no one has been looking at them. The foreman Hayes was angry about something that predated her arrival. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way he spoke to James Walker when James came into the barn. That specific kind of bluntness that isn't directness, but is actually a form of aggression dressed up as honesty. Will, the youngest hand, was homesick. He tried to hide it and mostly succeeded. She started making cornbread on Thursday evenings because she heard him tell another man, in passing, that his mother always made cornbread on Thursdays. He never thanked her. He didn't need to. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the kitchen. By the end of the second, she had established a supply system that meant they would stop running out of coffee and salt at the same time, which appeared to have been a recurring event before her arrival. By the end of the third week, she had started keeping the accounts, sitting at the small table in the corner of the main room each evening after the hands had gone to their quarters, with a lamp and a ledger, and the quiet that falls over a working ranch when the work is finished for the day. James found her there on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after her arrival. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "I added the October feed costs," she said. The calculation wasn't matching because 2 of the receipts from Henley's store had the wrong date. I moved them to the correct column. James came into the room and looked at the ledger over her shoulder. He said nothing for a moment. Where was the difference? $11.40. She pointed to the column. "It's here now." He studied the page. Then he said, quietly, "My previous housekeeper kept these books for 8 years, and they always balanced." Elizabeth looked up. "They should always balance," she said. James sat down across from her. He looked at her in the same way. He had looked at her on the platform, without the particular kind of distortion that comes from projecting one thing onto another, without seeing her as Thomas Reed's rejected bride, or Cedar Hollow's newest spectacle, or a woman who needed managing. He looked at her as if she were simply herself, which was rarer than it should have been, and which she had almost stopped expecting from anyone. "You don't have to do all of this," he said. She had heard this before. She had heard it from Will, who had caught her fixing a cabinet hinge, and looked guilty, as if he should have done it. She had heard it from Hayes, though in his mouth it sounded less like permission and more like a dare. From James it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like genuine concern. "The ledger is part of the arrangement," she said. The curtains weren't. She glanced toward the window. She had rehung them the previous Saturday. Evening light when the kitchen was empty. They hung straight now. "No," she said, "the curtains weren't." "So why?" She looked at him. "Because it cost nothing to do a thing properly," she said. "And everything hangs a little better when it's straight." James held her gaze. He had dark eyes, she had noticed. Not unkind. Very steady. The eyes of a man who had made decisions in difficult conditions, often enough that the difficulty no longer showed on his face, it had gone somewhere interior instead. And what remained on the surface was simply steadiness. He said, "My wife used to say that." Elizabeth went still. She had known, from things the hands mentioned, that there had been a wife. She had not known when or how, or what the loss had looked like. She had not asked, because it was not her business, and she was not sure she was the kind of person James Walker talked to about things that mattered. "I'm sorry," she said. 4 years ago," he said simply. Without the performance of grief that sometimes comes when people who have grieved for a long time talk about their loss. Fever, it was quick. He looked at the ledger, not at her. She was the one who built this place into something. "I built the walls. She made it a home." Elizabeth waited. "I've been trying to keep it running since then," he said. "Running is not the same thing." "No," Elizabeth said. "It isn't." They sat for a moment in the quiet. Then James got up. "The lamplighter is getting low," he said. "I'll bring more oil." He left her alone with the accounts, and she sat for a moment, without writing anything, listening to the sound of the ranch at night, the horses shifting in the barn, a coyote somewhere distant, the wind against the window glass, and she thought about walls and homes, and the distance between the two. She thought it was a very large distance. She thought she might know something about it. The rumors arrived in the 4th week. She heard them from Will first, because Will was young enough that he had not yet learned to filter around people who might be affected by it. He came into the kitchen one morning looking uncomfortable, in the specific way of someone carrying information they aren't sure they should deliver. "People in town are talking," he said. Elizabeth kept her hands in the bread dough. "People in town are always talking," she said. "About you." He paused. "About the situation, about why you're here. I know why I'm here." "Thomas Reed is..." Will stopped. Elizabeth looked up. "What is Thomas Reed saying?" Will's expression went through several versions of itself. "That you didn't have anywhere else to go," he said finally. "That you took the first thing offered, because you were desperate. That Mr. Walker took you on out of pity, because he felt bad about what happened at the station." Elizabeth went back to the bread. She worked the dough for a moment. Then she said, "Do you believe that?" Will blinked. No, I see what you do here. I see how you work." "Then why are you telling me?" "Because Hayes heard it too," Will said quietly. "And Hayes started wondering, if what? If people will start thinking Mr. Walker made a bad decision. If it makes the ranch look..." He stopped again. He had run out of ways to finish the sentence that didn't sound worse than the thing he was trying to say. Elizabeth straightened. She looked at him directly. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "I want you to know that." She turned back to the bread, pressing her knuckles into the dough. "And I want you to know something else. I don't work the way I work because I'm desperate and I have nowhere to go. I work the way I work because it's the only way I know how to work." She folded the dough. "Thomas Reed decided I wasn't worth his time based on 1 minute of observation. That's his business. But I don't intend to let his opinion of me become the story of my life." Will was quiet. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." He went back outside. Elizabeth stood at the work table for a moment, longer than necessary. She pressed her hands flat against the wood. She was very still. Then she finished making the bread. The confrontation with Samuel Hayes came at the end of that week. She had been expecting it. Hayes was a man who needed to know where things stood. He needed the hierarchy of a place to be visible and unambiguous, and her arrival had made it ambiguous. She was not a hand, she was not a wife. She was not the housekeeper in the way the previous woman had been, because the previous woman had been here for 8 years and had built authority through duration, and Elizabeth had been here less than a month. Hayes did not know what category to put her in, and not knowing made him irritable. He found her in the supply shed. She was counting bags of flour. He stood in the doorway. "You talked to Will," he said. "About the inventory?" Elizabeth kept counting. "About what's being said in town." She finished counting. She wrote the number down. Then she turned around. Hayes was a large man, and he used his size the way some people use volume, not as a threat exactly, but as a way of making clear that the threat was available if needed. He had a foreman's face, weathered and skeptical, the face of a man who has been right about most things for long enough, that being wrong feels like personal insult. "Mr. Hayes," Elizabeth said, "Ma'am, do you think I can do this job?" He considered the question without the usual social reflex of claiming he hadn't formed an opinion. "I think you can do parts of it," he said. "Which parts can't I do?" "The parts that matter long term. When this gets harder, when the season turns, when things go wrong, when it stops being interesting, city women leave." He crossed his arms. "I've seen it before. How many city women have you seen try it?" He hesitated. "2," he said. "Both left. Tell me about them." Hayes blinked. "Excuse me? Tell me about the 2 city women who left," Elizabeth said. "What happened? Why did they go? What was different about those situations?" He stared at her. She waited. He was, she could see, a man entirely unused to being asked to examine his own evidence. "One married a man who couldn't make the ranch work," he said slowly. "The operation failed. She left with him. Was she the problem?" "No," he admitted, "he was, and the other got sick," Hayes said. "Couldn't recover out here, not without a proper doctor. Went back east where there was better medicine." Elizabeth nodded. "So neither of them left because city women can't do ranch work," she said. "One left because the ranch failed. One left because she got sick. Those are different reasons." Hayes looked at her. That's different reasoning than most people bother with, he said. I know. He was quiet for a moment then. The bread's been better since you got here. Elizabeth almost smiled. I'll take that, she said. Hayes looked away, at the flour bags, at the shelves behind her. The Brewster account is wrong in the ledger, he said. Has been for 2 months. Thought you should know. He walked back out. Elizabeth turned back to the flour. She finished her count, and for the first time since arriving in Cedar Hollow, she allowed herself the small, private, careful thing that was not quite happiness, but was the shape of it. She allowed herself to feel like she might stay. The Brewster account had been wrong for 2 months, and nobody had said a word about it. That told Elizabeth more about the Walker Ranch than anything she had observed in her first 4 weeks. Not that the men were dishonest, she did not believe that. But there was a particular kind of neglect that sets in when people stop believing that the details matter, when the cumulative weight of loss has made them feel that precision is a luxury they can no longer afford. She had seen it in her father's house in the last months before he died. The small things stop being maintained because the large thing is already broken, and fixing a leaking barrel or a misbalanced ledger feels like repairing the curtains in a burning building. The Walker Ranch was not burning, but it had been not long ago, and the smoke was still in the walls. She corrected the Brewster account on a Friday evening. She found 2 additional discrepancies while she was at it, one in the November tally for Henley's feed store, one in a figure James had transferred from the older ledger into the current one and carried the wrong number across. Together, the 3 corrections changed the bottom line by just over $40. $40 was significant on a working ranch in a year that had been difficult. She left the corrected ledger on the table for James and said nothing about it. The next morning he walked into the kitchen while she was making breakfast and set the ledger on the counter beside her. You found 3, he said. I found 3. He looked at her for a moment. The Brewster one I knew about. I kept meaning to go back. The other 2? I didn't know about those. He picked up his coffee. $41.20. $41.60, she said. There was a partial adjustment on the last line. James set the cup down. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was adjusting something internal, recalculating. Not in a suspicious way, but in the way of a practical man, updating his understanding of a situation based on new information. You've been here 5 weeks, he said. Yes. In 5 weeks, you've reorganized the kitchen, fixed the supply system, rehung the curtains, repaired the barrel, sorted out the Thursday meal rotation, so Hayes stops complaining about cold food, and found $60 worth of errors in my ledger. $41.60. $41.60. He was quiet a moment. I'm going to need to pay you more. Elizabeth turned back to the eggs. We can discuss that when the season closes and you know what the numbers actually look like, she said. We can discuss it now. The eggs will burn if I have this conversation now. A pause. Then James picked up his coffee and went back to the main room, and she heard him settle into the chair at his desk, and the scratch of his pen, beginning its morning work. And she stood at the hearth and let herself breathe for a moment. In the particular way she breathed when something was going better than she had expected. It was a careful kind of breathing. She had learned not to breathe too freely when things were going well. Things changed quickly. She had learned that at 16, and again at 20, and she did not intend to forget it. But, standing in that kitchen on a Friday morning, with the smell of coffee and the sound of the ranch waking up outside, with the ledger corrected, and the bread rising, and Samuel Hayes's voice carrying across the yard, giving the day's first orders in a tone that had, she noticed, lost some of its earlier edge, she allowed herself that small, careful breath. She was still here. That was not nothing. The real trouble with Cedar Hollow arrived not from the direction she expected, but from the one she had been careful to ignore. Thomas Reed did not stay gone. She had understood on some level that he wouldn't. Cedar Hollow was not a large town. A man could not avoid a woman in a small town unless both parties were committed to a project, and Thomas Reed, she was slowly realizing, was not the kind of man who committed to difficult projects. He was the kind of man who preferred situations that resolved themselves in his favor, without requiring him to do the uncomfortable work of resolution. She first saw him again on a Saturday, when she went into town for supplies. She had borrowed the small wagon and made the trip alone, which was her preference, because trips into town required a particular kind of attention that was easier to manage without the added complexity of another person's responses. Cedar Hollow was still in the process of deciding what it thought of her, and she could feel that undecided quality in every interaction in the way Mrs. Calloway at the dry goods store watched her count out coins, with a look that mixed curiosity and something close to reluctant respect. In the way the men outside the barber shop went slightly quiet when she passed, and then resumed, talking a beat too quickly. She was loading the last of the supplies into the wagon bed when Thomas Reed appeared. He looked the same as he had at the train station. Same hat, same vest, same carefully maintained posture that conveyed authority he was always slightly worried about losing. He stopped a few feet away. "Miss Carter." Elizabeth secured the last bag. Mr. Reed, a pause. "You look well," he said. She turned to face him. "Thank you. How is the—" He stopped, started again. "How is the situation at Walker's Ranch working out?" The phrasing told her everything. The situation, not the job. Not the arrangement. The situation, which was the word people used when they wanted to discuss something, without acknowledging it directly. "The ranch is working out well," she said. "Thank you for asking." Thomas nodded slowly. He had something he wanted to say. She could see it, the way a man carries a prepared speech, slightly visibly, the way he keeps touching the edge of it in his mind, the way you keep touching a loose tooth. "I wanted to say," he started. "That day at the station I may have the decision was made quickly, and I may not have." Mr. Reed. Elizabeth kept her voice even. "You don't owe me an explanation." "I'm not sure that's true." "Then let me be clearer." She looked at him directly. "You made your decision, and I've made mine. We're both living with the outcomes. I don't require anything from you." He looked slightly stung. "Good," said a small part of her that she usually kept very quiet. "People are talking," he said, "about you being at Walker's place. About whether it's appropriate." Elizabeth kept her eyes on his. "People were talking before I arrived in Cedar Hollow," she said. "They talked while I was at the train station. They talked while I walked away from you. They talked when James Walker offered me a job. I expect people will be talking long after both of us have stopped paying attention." She picked up the wagon reins. "I've never found other people's conversations very useful for making my own decisions. I don't intend to start." She drove back to the ranch. She did not let herself shake until she was past the first bend in the road, where the tree line was thick enough that no one from town could see the wagon. Then she sat with the shaking for exactly 30 seconds. Then she steadied her hands. Then she kept driving. When she got back to the ranch, Hayes was in the yard. He took one look at her face. "Trouble in town," he said. "Nothing that requires action," she said. He helped her unload the supplies without another word. But she noticed that at dinner that evening, he told the men a story about a banker from Denver who had ridden through Cedar Hollow 3 years ago, trying to convince local ranchers to sell their water rights, and how the ranchers had responded. And the story ended with the banker leaving Cedar Hollow on foot because his horse had developed a mysterious lameness, the origin of which no one had been able to explain. Elizabeth said nothing. Will laughed very hard. Hayes met her eyes across the table. He raised his coffee cup very slightly. She raised hers. That was the moment Elizabeth Carter understood that Samuel Hayes had decided she was allowed to stay. The first large twist came 9 days later, and it did not come from Thomas Reed. It came from a man Elizabeth had never seen before, who arrived at the Walker Ranch on a Tuesday morning in a very clean coat, driving a very new buggy, accompanied by a man who carried papers and never spoke. His name was Richard Caldwell. She heard James say the name from the porch. and she heard the way James said it, the particular flatness of a man who has been expecting something unpleasant and has been hoping the expectation would prove wrong, and now sees that it won't. Elizabeth had come to the doorway with a dishcloth in her hands. She watched the exchange from where she stood. Richard Caldwell was perhaps 50 years old. He had the build of a man who had once been physically powerful and had since converted that power into something more sedentary and more dangerous. He smiled a great deal. She noticed that his smiles never quite synchronized with his eyes. Walker, he extended his hand. Good to see you. It's been, what, 4 months? 5, James said. He shook the hand briefly. 5. Time moves. Caldwell looked around the yard, at the barn, at the fence line, at the corrals. Place is looking better than I expected, honestly. Heard you'd had a rough season. We had a difficult spring, James said. Summer was better. Good. Caldwell's smile held. That's good to hear. He reached back toward the man with the papers, who produced a document without being asked. Caldwell held it out toward James. I've updated my offer. Given the situation with the northern water access, I thought it was worth coming back with revised numbers. More realistic numbers. James did not take the document. I haven't changed my position, he said. James. Caldwell let the name sit alone for a moment. Casual and familiar, the use of the first name a small act of territorial claiming. The northern water rights are the issue. You know that, and I know that. If the county board moves on the redesignation, you're going to find yourself fighting a legal process that costs more than the land is worth. I'm offering you a way to, I know what you're offering. Then let me ask you something. Caldwell's voice stayed pleasant. Can you afford the lawyer it would take to fight it? Because I know what your season looked like. I know what the cattle prices did in September, and I know what your outstanding accounts look like, because I made it my business to find out. The yard was very quiet. Elizabeth stood in the doorway. James said, You made it your business. That's what businessmen do, Caldwell said. James looked at the document. He did not take it. I'll think about it, he said. Of course. Caldwell rolled the document back and handed it to his associate. Take your time, but I'd encourage you not to take too much. The county board meets in 6 weeks. He got back into the buggy. He looked toward the house, and for the first time, his gaze found Elizabeth in the doorway. His expression registered her existence in a way she did not like. A quick assessment. A filing, the way a man notes an element of a situation that he may need to factor into his plans. The buggy left. James stood in the yard. Elizabeth put the dishcloth down and came out onto the porch. James said, without turning around, You heard that. I heard it. You don't need to concern yourself with the water rights, she said. How long has this been going on? A pause. 2 years, he said. He first approached me 2 years ago. The offer gets larger every time. What does he want the land for? Development. There's a man in Denver who wants to build a road through this section of the territory. The water access is what makes the northern route viable. Without this ranch in the way, he can get the road through, and Caldwell takes a percentage. How large is the percentage? Significant enough that Caldwell has made 5 separate trips to offer me money. Elizabeth came down the porch steps. She stood beside him. And the county board, she said. They can redesignate the water rights as commercial if they vote in favor of development. His voice was careful. It would take 6 months to challenge legally, maybe longer. The challenge would cost money I don't currently have. She looked at the road, where the buggy had disappeared. He knows your accounts, she said, apparently. Someone told him. James looked at her. She looked back. Who handles your accounts in town? She said. The bank. Who at the bank? A long pause. Wallace Preston, James said slowly. We've done business for 15 years. Is Preston connected to Caldwell? James said nothing. But his expression said everything. Elizabeth went back inside. She sat down at the ledger table. She opened the accounts. She did not panic. Panic was not useful, and she had trained herself out of most of it over the years, the way you train yourself out of reaching for something that burned you. You don't stop wanting the warmth. You just learn to be careful about where you put your hands. She looked at the numbers. She looked at them for a long time. Then she got up and went to find Hayes. She found him in the barn. He looked up when she came in. She said, "I need to know everything about the county board meeting." Hayes stared at her. "Why? Because Richard Caldwell is going to try to use it to take this ranch," she said. "And I need to understand the process before I can understand where to push back." Hayes was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he put down the tool in his hand. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He talked for 40 minutes. He told her about the county board, who was on it, who owed Caldwell favors, who was genuinely undecided, who was a man of principle, and who was a man of convenience. He told her about the redesignation process, which he understood from a dispute 3 years prior involving a neighboring property. He told her about the precedents the board had followed, and the ones they had ignored, and the circumstances under which ignoring a precedent had cost a board member his seat. Elizabeth listened. She asked 7 questions. Hayes answered all 7. When she stood up to leave, he said, "You're going to try to stop him." "I'm going to try to help James stop him," she said. "It's his ranch." Hayes nodded slowly. "You've been here 6 weeks," he said. "I know, 6 weeks is not very long. I know that too." He looked at her. "Why does it matter to you?" he said. "You could find work somewhere else. If this ranch goes under, you find another position." Elizabeth stopped. She turned around. She looked at Hayes in the dim light of the barn. "My father built a cabinet-making business for 20 years, she said. He was sick for the last 2. He couldn't keep up. He borrowed against the shop to cover the medical bills, and then he couldn't make the repayments, and the bank sold the shop, and 6 men lost their jobs." She paused. "I watched those 6 men try to explain to their families why Christmas was different that year. I watched my father's face when he heard that the new owner had pulled down the sign with his name on it." She looked Hayes directly in the eye. "I know what it looks like when someone takes a thing a person built. I know exactly what it looks like." Hayes said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "The board member you want is Elias Grover. 3rd seat on the left. He's the only undecided one who actually reads the land law." Elizabeth nodded. She walked back to the house. She had a great deal of work to do. James found her that evening with the ledger, the county land records she had quietly borrowed from the town hall files, when she had been in Cedar Hollow 2 weeks ago, and a legal summary she had found in James's own desk drawer, a letter from a lawyer in Denver that he had apparently received and not opened. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the spread of documents across the table. He said, "What are you doing?" "Reading," she said. "Elizabeth." She looked up. It was the first time he had used her first name. They both noticed it at the same time. The silence went a beat longer than it needed to. "You don't need to," he started. "The lawyer's letter in your desk," she said. "You haven't opened it." He was quiet. "It arrived 3 weeks ago," she said. "I didn't read it, but I can see the return address from where I'm sitting. Denver, Brannigan and Cole, they're a property law firm. They've been writing to you for 6 weeks. She kept her voice even. "You're not going to fight for this, are you?" He sat down across the table. She waited. "Fighting costs money," he said. "I know. And I don't have. I know what you don't have," she said. "I've been looking at your accounts for 5 weeks. I know exactly what you have and what you don't." She turned the ledger so he could see it. "But I also know what Caldwell doesn't know about. The cattle at the south pasture that aren't in the main tally. The private agreement with the Morrison family for grazing rights on their east section. 3 smaller accounts that were filed under the old entry system before your previous housekeeper changed the format." James leaned forward. He looked at the figures. "If you convert the Morrison agreement," Elizabeth said, "and if the south pasture cattle go to market before February, you have enough to retain a lawyer for 6 weeks. She pointed to a number. "That's enough time to get to the county board meeting and make a formal objection." James stared at the page. "It's tight," he said. "It's very tight," she agreed. "And if it doesn't work?" Then you're $40 poorer than you would have been, she said. And you still have the ranch. He looked up. And if Caldwell wins the board vote? She held his gaze. Then we look at what comes next, she said. But I'd rather fight and lose than she stopped. Then what? She thought about her father's face when they took down his sign. Then not try, she said. James was quiet. He looked at her for a long time in that way. He had that careful, steady, recalibrating look. You said we, he said. Elizabeth looked at the ledger. I said we, she turned a page. I can correct that if it was presumptuous. Another silence. No, James said, don't correct it. He reached across the table and opened the lawyer's letter. He read it. He passed it to Elizabeth. She read it. The lawyer, a man named Brannigan, had been tracking the Caldwell situation from Denver for reasons he didn't explain directly. But he indicated that he had handled 2 similar redesignation cases in the past 4 years, and that the county board had a specific procedural vulnerability that had been successfully exploited in both instances. He offered a consultation at significantly reduced rate given what he called the particular circumstances of this land dispute. Elizabeth set the letter down. He knows something about the board, she said. It sounds that way. Can you afford the consultation? Barely. She looked at him. Write to him tonight, she said. James looked at her. Then he said, Do you always move this fast? Elizabeth thought about 1,400 miles on a westbound train, with a small suitcase and 3 letters and a lifetime of hope that had collapsed within 60 seconds of arrival. When I need to, she said. James pulled a sheet of paper toward him. He began to write. Elizabeth turned back to the accounts, and the room settled into the particular quiet of 2 people working toward the same thing, each in their own column, moving in the same direction, and it was not the quiet of emptiness. It was the quiet of something being built. What neither of them said, that night, or for several nights afterward, was the thing that was also present in the room, the thing that had been building, since the first night he sat across from her and talked about walls and homes, and the distance between them. It was not large yet. It was the size of a curtain rehung straight, the size of a ledger corrected, the size of a name said aloud for the first time. But it was there. And Elizabeth Carter, who had trained herself to be careful about reaching for things that had burned her before, could feel its warmth from across the table. She did not reach for it, not yet, but she did not move away from it either. And that, for now, was its own kind of answer. The next morning, Hayes came into the kitchen before anyone else was up. He sat down at the table. Elizabeth poured him coffee. He looked at it. He said, Caldwell was in town yesterday afternoon. After he left here, he wrapped both hands around the cup. He was talking to Preston at the bank, and after that, he went to see Thomas Reed. Elizabeth was very still. Why Thomas Reed, she said. Because Reed knows this ranch, Hayes said. And because Reed's been angry since you got here. He looked at her. Angry men say things they shouldn't say, about ranch operations. About weaknesses. Elizabeth set the coffee pot down. She looked at the window. How much does Thomas Reed know about this ranch? She said. Hayes was quiet. He ran cattle near the north section for 3 years, he said. Before James bought the Morrison grazing agreement. He knows where the water feeds. He knows which sections flood in spring. He paused. He knows where the vulnerabilities are. Elizabeth turned around. Then we need to move faster than we planned, she said. Hayes looked at her. He said, with something in his voice she had not heard from him before, something that was not quite respect, and was also not quite surprise, but was the specific combination of the two that happens when a person exceeds your expectations so thoroughly that the revision of your understanding is audible. What do you need me to do? Elizabeth told him. He listened. He didn't argue with a single word. That, she thought, was worth more than the ledger correction. That was the moment the ranch became something she was fighting for, not just working in. And somewhere on the other side of that shift, on the far side of the thing, she was only beginning to let herself feel. James Walker was writing a letter to a lawyer in Denver. And outside the window, the Colorado morning was doing what Colorado mornings do, which is arrive with a kind of brightness that makes everything look like it might be possible. She let herself look at it for 3 seconds. Then she started making breakfast. The letter went out on Wednesday. By Thursday, Richard Caldwell had made his second move. Elizabeth found out the way she found out most things on the Walker Ranch, not because someone told her directly, but because she paid attention to the things people said around the edges of what they meant. Will came in for his midday meal with a tightness around his jaw that hadn't been there at breakfast. Two of the other hands, Martin and Pete, ate without talking, which was unusual enough that she counted the words exchanged between them during the entire meal and arrived at 11. Hayes didn't come in for lunch at all, which had never happened in the 7 weeks she had been at the ranch. She took a plate out to the barn. Hayes was working over a piece of harness with more force than the leather deserved. Elizabeth set the plate on the bench beside him. "Tell me," she said. He looked up. "Caldwell went to the Morrison family," he said. The Morrison grazing agreement, the one she had identified as the financial bridge that made the legal fight possible. "When," she said, "yesterday, after dark." Hayes set the harness down. He offered them twice what James pays for the grazing rights. Told them the Walker Ranch was a sinking investment and they'd be better off aligning with a buyer who could actually develop the land. Elizabeth processed this. Did they accept? Not yet. He picked up his coffee. But Isaac Morrison is 63 years old, and his son wants to move to Denver, and the only thing keeping the Morrison family in this county is inertia, and the fact that they've always done business with James Walker. Because James Walker is trustworthy. Because James Walker's father was trustworthy, Hayes corrected. And that matters in this county, but it has a generational limit. He looked at her. Caldwell knows that. Elizabeth stood for a moment. She thought about the speed of it, the fact that Caldwell had moved within 48 hours of visiting the ranch, which meant he was not deliberating. He was executing a plan he had already designed, one that had probably been waiting for the right moment and had found it the moment he saw that James was still standing and had not yet folded. A man who hesitates does not move within 48 hours. A man who moves that fast is afraid of something. What is he afraid of? She said aloud. Hayes looked at her. Time, she said, thinking it through as she spoke. He has 6 weeks before the county board meeting. He thought James would accept the offer by now. He didn't. Now he's trying to cut off the financial options before James can use them. She looked at Hayes. He doesn't know about the lawyer yet. No. Then we have a window. She picked up the empty plate. We need to talk to the Morrisons first. James should be the one too. James is riding the south pasture today, she said. And Caldwell will move again by tomorrow if he doesn't hear back from Isaac Morrison. We don't have time to wait for the right person. She paused. Do you have a problem with me going? Hayes looked at her for a long moment. I have a problem with a lot of things, he said. I've stopped letting them slow me down. She took that as a yes. She took the small wagon. The Morrison property was 4 miles north of the Walker Ranch, and she drove it, thinking through what she would say, and, more precisely, what she would not say. She had a tendency, when she was anxious, to over-explain, to stack reasons on top of reasons, until the original reason was buried, and the listener was overwhelmed by the scaffolding. She had been working on that for years. Today she needed to be simple. Isaac Morrison was a man who had operated on the same principles for 60 years, and men like that were not moved by elaborate arguments. They were moved by the one thing that had always mattered: loyalty to the people who deserved it. Isaac Morrison was sitting on his porch when she arrived. He was a broad man who had contracted with age, without losing any of the fundamental structure of the person he had been at 40. He had white hair and careful eyes. He watched her climb down from the wagon with an expression that told her he already knew who she was and had been forming opinions at a distance. Miss Carter, he said. She stopped at the foot of the steps. Mr. Morrison. She looked at him directly. I won't take up much of your time. I know Richard Caldwell came to see you yesterday. He didn't deny it. He made an offer, she said. He did. I'm not here to counter it financially, she said. I can't. The Walker Ranch is in a difficult season, and you're probably aware of that better than I am, because you've been watching it for a long time. She paused. I'm here to ask you one question. Morrison leaned forward slightly. In 15 years of doing business with James Walker, she said, has he ever cost you anything? Has he ever been late with a payment, or short on an agreement, or moved the terms of a deal without your knowledge? A long silence. No, Morrison said. Has Richard Caldwell ever cost anyone in this county anything? A different silence. That's a different kind of question, Morrison said slowly. Yes, she said, it is. He looked at her. The Hendersons sold their North Water access to a Caldwell-connected buyer 3 years ago, she said. I've been reading the county land records. They were told the designation would improve their access to the South Creek. It didn't. The creek access was sold separately 6 months later, and the Hendersons ended up without water rights for the lower third of their property. She met his gaze. I found that in public documents, I'm not guessing. Morrison was quiet. She let him be quiet. She had learned that some conversations were won by speaking, and some by stopping. James knows you're here? He said at last. No, she said honestly. He looked at her with a slight narrowing that wasn't suspicion exactly, but was its close relative. Then why are you here? Elizabeth thought about how to answer that. Because this ranch employs 6 men, and their families depend on it, she said. Because James Walker gave me work when nobody else in Cedar Hollow would look me in the eye. Because the right side of this is visible to anyone who takes 30 seconds to look at the evidence. She paused. And because I'd rather be wrong about overstepping than right about staying quiet. Morrison studied her. He said, Thomas Reed says you're a troublemaker. Thomas Reed sent me back on a train, Elizabeth said. I'd consider the source. Something happened in Morrison's face. It might have been a smile. My son wants to take Caldwell's money, he said. I know. He's not wrong that it's more money. He's not wrong about the amount, Elizabeth agreed. He might be wrong about what it costs. Morrison stood up. He was taller standing than she had expected. You tell James Walker, he said, that I'll honor the grazing agreement through the board meeting. After that, he paused. After that, we'll see how the land sits. Elizabeth let out the breath she had been holding since she left the ranch. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me if Walker wins. She drove back to the ranch and told Hayes. He nodded once. Slowly, the way he nodded, when something confirmed a calculation he had already been running. 4 weeks, he said. We need to keep it together for 4 weeks. We will, she said. She was not certain of that. But she said it with enough conviction that it sounded like certainty, and sometimes that was the same thing. James came back from the south pasture that evening. He found Elizabeth at the table, with the records spread out again, a new set of notes she had been making in the margins. He looked at the table. He looked at her face. Something happened, he said. She told him about Morrison. All of it, the visit, the conversation, the concession Morrison had offered. She told him about Caldwell's move the previous day, and about the Henderson land records, and about what she believed Caldwell was doing, and why he was doing it faster than he needed to. James listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he sat down. He was quiet for a long time. You went to Morrison without asking me, he said. Yes, why? Because there wasn't time, she said. And because I knew you would tell me, it wasn't my place. It isn't your place, I know that. Another silence. Did Morrison say anything about? He said he'd honor the agreement through the board meeting, she said. He said after that we'd see how the land sits. That's better than I expected, James said quietly. I thought so too. He looked at her. She met his eyes and then looked away, back at the records, because the look was one she didn't know how to hold yet. It was the look of someone seeing her, not the competent housekeeper or the resourceful woman with the ledger, but the person underneath those things, the one who had driven 4 miles in a borrowed wagon on an uncertain mission because she could not sit quietly while something worth saving came apart. You keep doing this, he said. She kept her eyes on the records. Doing what? Carrying things that aren't yours to carry. She put down her pen. She looked at him. Your wife made this place into a home, she said. You told me that. And then she was gone, and you've been trying to keep it running for 4 years, and running is not the same thing. She held his gaze. I've been in houses that are only running before. I know what they feel like, and I know what it costs the people inside them. The room was very quiet. James said, "Why does it matter to you?" It was the same question Hayes had asked in the barn. But from James, it carried a different weight, a different direction, like it was asking something that went further than the ranch and further than the practical situation, and somewhere neither of them had named yet. It matters, she said simply. He did not push further. But the word sat in the room after she said it. The way certain words do not ending the conversation but deepening it. The way a stone dropped in still water doesn't just make a splash, but makes rings that travel outward for a long time after. The crisis arrived in the form of a document delivered by a county official on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before the board meeting. It was a formal notice of contested land designation, the legal mechanism Caldwell was using to force the redesignation to a commercial vote. Elizabeth read it 3 times while James was still standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. Then she read it a 4th time with the law summary from Brannigan's letter beside it. She found the problem in the 3rd paragraph. The filing listed the water access as entirely commercial by historical use, which was not accurate. The Walker Ranch had held agricultural water rights for 22 years. But the document cited a survey from 14 years ago that had misclassified a section of the North Creek feed as common land, which technically meant it had not been under continuous private agricultural use for the required period. It was the kind of error that was designed to look like a fact. She took the document inside. She sat down. She pulled every land record she had from the town hall files. She went back through 7 years of water usage filings that James had made with the county, looking for the one thing she needed, a contemporaneous filing from the period the survey had misclassified. A document in which James, or his father, had asserted private agricultural use of the North Creek section before the incorrect survey was recorded. She found it in a filing from 18 years ago. James's father. A handwritten annual usage declaration, signed, dated, and correctly classified, predating the misclassified survey by 4 years. If the declaration held as evidence, it broke the foundation of Caldwell's legal argument. Elizabeth sat back in her chair. She was shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the particular physical response that comes when you have been working very hard at something for a very long time, and the thing suddenly yields when the locked door opens, when the knot comes free, when the number in the column finally balances. Hayes, she called. He appeared in the doorway almost immediately, which told her he had been nearby, which told her he had been watching the situation with more anxiety than he showed. Get James, she said now. Hayes took one look at her face. He didn't ask questions. James came in 2 minutes later, still wearing his work gloves. Elizabeth set the 2 documents side by side on the table. Sit down, she said. He sat. She showed him. She explained what she had found and why it mattered and how it undermined the foundation of Caldwell's filing. She used plain language, not legal language, because this was not the moment for precision. This was the moment for clarity. James read the original declaration. He read it twice. That's my father's handwriting, he said quietly. I know, he kept looking at it. He filed this the year I turned 17, he said. I remember him doing it. He said the county was getting sloppy with water designations, and he wasn't going to leave anything ambiguous. He was right, Elizabeth said. James looked up. This is what Brannigan needs, she said. This is what breaks the filing. Send it tonight. Elizabeth, tonight, she said. Caldwell moves fast. We need to move faster. James looked at her. Then he said, How did you find this? I read everything, she said. People don't read everything. I do. She held his gaze. I have been reading everything in this county's public record for 3 weeks. Every filing, every designation, Every contested use claim going back 25 years. Because I knew Caldwell's argument had to be built on something, and I knew if it was built on something then. Somewhere in the record, there was a document that showed what that something actually was. He was very still. 3 weeks, he said. Yes. While you were also running the household, and managing the accounts, and making the Thursday cornbread that Will specifically eats 2 portions of. The cornbread doesn't take very long. James looked at her for a moment that stretched past what a practical conversation required. Then he stood up. He took the declaration. He sat down at his desk and began writing to Brannigan. Elizabeth went to make coffee. Her hands were still slightly unsteady. She stood at the hearth and waited for the water to heat, and she did not let herself think about what came next. She let herself think about right now, which was the only thing she had ever really been able to depend on. Right now the document existed. Right now the letter was being written. Right now the ranch was still standing, and 6 men were employed, and the Thursday cornbread was in the bread tin, and the accounts were balanced. Right now was enough. The second large twist came 4 days before the board meeting, and it arrived in a way Elizabeth had not anticipated because she had been focused in the wrong direction. She had been watching Caldwell. She had not been watching Thomas Reed. It was Will who brought it to her on a Saturday evening, looking pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Miss Carter," he said. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He was holding his hat in both hands the way James had held his that first day at the train station. "I heard something in town today, at the barber shop." "Sit down, Will." He sat. "Thomas Reed is going to speak at the board meeting," he said. Elizabeth set the dish she was holding down carefully. "In what capacity?" she said, as they called it, an interested party. "Someone who has knowledge of the Walker Ranch's operations." Will twisted the hat in his hands. "He's going to say," he stopped. He's going to say the ranch has been mismanaged. That the operation was failing before you got here, and that the only thing keeping it going now is that the books have been." He stopped again. "That James had help from someone who doesn't understand ranch operations and made decisions that looked good on paper, but don't reflect the real situation on the ground." Elizabeth was very still. "He's going to argue that the agricultural use claim isn't valid," Will said, "because the ranch hasn't been operating at full agricultural capacity for 2 seasons. Which is, it's partially." He looked at her helplessly. "It's technically true. The spring was bad. We weren't at full capacity." "No," Elizabeth said. "We weren't." She thought about this. She thought about the fact that Thomas Reed had been on this ranch 3 years ago, when the North grazing section was still active. He would know the production figures. He would know which seasons had been difficult. And he would know, better than almost anyone, where the argument about continuous agricultural use was vulnerable. "He's giving Caldwell the inside knowledge," she said. "Yes," Will said quietly. "That's what it sounds like." She sat down across from him. She had known, abstractly, that Thomas Reed was angry. Angry men did things. She had just believed she realized now that the anger was too private and too small to build itself into something that could reach inside the board meeting and damage the one defense she had spent 3 weeks constructing. She had underestimated him. She did not waste time being angry at herself for that. "When did you hear this?" she said. "This afternoon." "Does James know?" "I came here first," Will said. Elizabeth stood. "Go find Hayes," she said. "Tell him what you told me. Tell him to come to the main house at sundown." She picked up her shawl. "I need to speak to James." She found him in the barn. She told him everything Will had said, standing in the doorway, without softening any of it. James listened. When she finished, his jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. The specific set of a man who is not surprised and wishes he were. "He talked to Caldwell's people," James said. "Yes." "He knows the operating figures." "Yes." James turned away. He stood for a moment with his hands braced against the stall post. And she gave him that moment because he had earned it, because the specific pain of being betrayed by someone you once trusted enough to invite into a business arrangement is its own distinct kind of wound, and it does not yield to rushing. Then he turned back around. "What do we do?" he said. She felt the weight of the question land precisely where it was aimed. Not at the ranch, not at the legal problem, at her. He was asking her. "We tell the truth," she said, "before Reed can." James looked at her. "We go to the board and we tell them everything," she said. "Not just the document, all of it. The difficult spring. The reduced capacity. The decisions that were made, and why they were made. We don't let Reed be the one who defines the narrative." She kept her voice level. "The worst thing a bad season can do to a rancher is embarrass him. It's only dangerous in front of a board if it's a secret. If James Walker walks into that meeting and says openly, 'Yes, we had a difficult 2 years. Here is what happened. Here is what changed. Here is the documented history of our water rights and our agricultural claim,' then Thomas Reed has nothing to reveal. He has nothing that isn't already on the table." James was quiet. "You want me to walk in there and tell them everything that went wrong," he said. "I want you to walk in there before Caldwell's witness does," she said. "And I want you to tell the story your way." He looked at her. "Will it work?" he said. She answered honestly. "I don't know," she said. "But the alternative is letting Reed walk in and tell it his way. And that I know won't work." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. She went back to the house. She stayed up until 2 in the morning, writing down everything they knew, in order, with the documents arranged beside each point. Hayes sat with her until midnight. Then he went to sleep, and she kept writing, and the lamp burned lower, and the ranch outside the window was completely quiet, and she sat alone at the table with the records, and the careful notes, and the thing she was fighting for. She thought about her father's sign. She thought about the men who had stood outside the cabinet shop on the day the bank sold it, holding their hats. She thought about what it costs to lose a thing you built. She thought about James Walker's face when he looked at the declaration in his father's handwriting. She kept writing. By the time the sun came up, the document in front of her was 12 pages long. It contained the complete history of the Walker Ranch's water rights claim, the specific evidence that broke Caldwell's filing, the counter to every argument Thomas Reed could make about operating capacity, and a final page that she wrote last and was the most important because it was the simplest. It said only, "This ranch is still here because the people inside it chose to fight for each other." She wasn't sure if they would use that part, but she wrote it anyway. Because it was true, and she had promised herself, a long time ago, standing on a train platform in the Colorado Territory, with a small suitcase and a return ticket she refused to take, that she would never again say less than what was true. She set the document on the table for James to find. She made coffee. She started breakfast. The board meeting was 4 days away. James read the 12 pages before breakfast. Elizabeth knew because she heard him get up before dawn. She heard the floor creak above her, the sound of boots, the slow descending footsteps that a man makes when he is not trying to wake anyone and trying too hard at it. She heard him settle at the desk. She heard the lamp catch. She did not go out. She stayed in her room and listened to the silence that followed, which was the silence of a person reading something carefully, not skimming, reading the way you read a thing that matters. She was making coffee when he finally came into the kitchen. He set the document on the counter beside her. He said nothing for a moment. Then the last page. She kept her eyes on the coffee pot. "I wasn't sure if that part. Leave it in," he said. She looked at him. His face was the kind of composed that costs something. She recognized it. She had worn it herself on a train platform not so long ago. "All of it," she said. "All of it." He picked up the coffee she handed him. Brannigan wrote back. He received the declaration. "He says it substantially alters the legal footing." He paused. "He's coming to Cedar Hollow." Elizabeth went still. "When?" "Day after tomorrow." James held the cup in both hands. "He rode the overnight from Denver. Said he didn't want this filed without him in the room." That's significant. That's what I thought." She let herself feel the small heat of that for exactly 1 moment. Then she said, "Caldwell will find out he's coming." "Probably. It might push him to move again before the meeting." "Probably," James said again. "We need Hayes to know. And Will needs to watch the road from the Morrison property if Caldwell tries to approach Morrison again before the meeting. I want to know within the hour." James looked at her over his coffee cup. "You've been planning this all night," he said. "I've been planning this for 2 weeks," she said. "Last night I just wrote it down." Something moved through his expression, not a smile. Something more private than a smile. Something that was his, and that she caught. Only because she had been paying close attention to his face for 2 months and had learned the vocabulary of it, the way you learn a language by immersion, rather than by studying the grammar. He went to find Hayes. Elizabeth finished the coffee and started breakfast, and told herself very firmly not to think about what it meant that he had said leave it in. This ranch is still here because the people inside it chose to fight for each other. She cracked 4 eggs and did not think about it at all. Brannigan arrived on Thursday afternoon in a buggy that had seen a great deal of Colorado Road and wore the evidence proudly. He was younger than Elizabeth expected, perhaps 38. Lean and quick-eyed, with the particular alertness of a man who made his living finding the precise word in a thicket of imprecise language. He shook James's hand and then looked at Elizabeth with the expression of someone reassessing a situation based on information he had received in advance. "Miss Carter," he said, "the woman who found the Walker Declaration." "The declaration was in the public record," she said. "It was findable. It was findable. If you knew to look for it, understood what it meant when you found it, and connected it to a 14-year-old survey error that most people would have read as settled record." He tilted his head. "Have you done legal research before?" "No. Would you like to?" James made a sound from behind her. Brannigan smiled slightly and let the question go. They sat at the table, all 3 of them, and Brannigan laid out his assessment. The declaration was strong. Not airtight, he was careful to say, because very few things in county land law were airtight, but strong enough to force the board to consider the question seriously rather than rubber-stamp Caldwell's filing. The procedural vulnerability he had mentioned in his letter was real, and he had the precedent to support it. If the board followed its own established procedure, Caldwell's filing could not proceed to a full commercial redesignation vote without a 60-day review period. "Which takes us past the road developer's deadline," Elizabeth said. Brannigan looked at her. "Correct," he said. "If we force the review period, the development timeline collapses. Caldwell loses the investor. The entire project becomes financially unviable." He paused. "Which means the goal for the board meeting is not necessarily to win the designation question outright. The goal is to force the review. And Thomas Reed," James said. Brannigan's expression shifted. "Tell me about Reed," he said. James told him. Elizabeth added the parts. James didn't know the things Will had heard at the barber's shop, the specific arguments Reed was apparently prepared to make about operating capacity. Brannigan listened without interrupting, which she had already identified as the sign of someone who was actually thinking, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. "How much does Reed know about the North Section's production figures?" Brannigan asked. "Enough," James said. "Specific figures? Documented figures?" "He ran cattle on the adjacent land for 3 years. He has general knowledge." James paused. "He doesn't have access to the actual records." "Then his testimony is general knowledge," Brannigan said, "which the board will weigh against documented evidence. That is a contest we can win." He looked between them. "But I want to be prepared for everything he might say. Walk me through the 2 difficult seasons, every decision, every reason, every outcome." James walked him through it. Elizabeth listened. She was doing something she had been doing since the previous night, building the shape of the board meeting in her mind, running through the possible sequences, anticipating where it could go wrong and where it could be protected. She had never been inside a county board meeting. She did not know these 5 men personally. But she knew them, the way she knew the 6 ranch hands, not through introduction, but through reading, through the county records. Through the overnight, not all at once, through the 14 years of decisions and filings and contested matters that had passed through their hands and left their signatures in the public record. After Brannigan left to settle at the boarding house in town, James stayed at the table. He looked at the empty chairs. "I should have opened that letter 6 weeks ago," he said. "You opened it when you were ready," she said. "That's a kind way of saying I waited too long. It's an accurate way of saying you were carrying more than one person should have to carry alone." She began stacking the papers. "You waited until you had help. That's not weakness. It's just mathematics." He looked at her. "Mathematics," he repeated. "One person can carry a finite amount," she said. "2 people can carry more. That's mathematics." He was quiet. "Elizabeth," she kept stacking. "Look at me." She looked at him. The table was between them, and the lamp was low, and she could hear the ranch at evening, the horses settling, the distant sound of the hands finishing the day's last work, and James Walker looked at her with a directness that made the distance across the table feel both exactly right and entirely too much. "Whatever happens at that meeting," he said, "whatever the board decides, what you've done here, what you've been doing since the first day." He stopped. Started more carefully. "I want you to know that I see it." She held very still. "I know you said you're not carrying things that aren't yours," he continued. "But this ranch, the people in it, I think they're becoming yours. Whether you meant for that to happen or not." She said, "James." "I'm not asking anything," he said. "I just wanted to say it." She looked at him for a moment. That was longer than it needed to be. Then she said, "I know," 2 words. But she said them in the tone that means more than 2 words, and he received them in the same tone, and neither of them said anything further, and that was the right decision, because there would be time for the further thing later, on the other side of whatever the next 2 days brought in. She hoped. The morning of the board meeting arrived gray and cold, the kind of cold that had come early this year and was making itself comfortable before winter proper arrived. The 5 ranch hands ate breakfast without talking. Hayes drank 3 cups of coffee, which was 2 more than usual. Will kept checking the window for reasons he did not explain, and did not need to. James had been up before Elizabeth. She found him at the desk when she came out, not writing, just sitting. She put coffee in front of him. He looked up. "Ready?" she said. "No," he said. "Let's go anyway." She went to get her shawl. Cedar Hollow's meeting hall was the largest building in town after the church, and by the time James and Elizabeth arrived with Brannigan driving his own buggy behind them, it was already more than half full. Elizabeth recognized faces: Mrs. Calloway from the dry goods store, the barber, a man named Whitford, several ranchers from the surrounding area, men with the specific posture of people who had come because the outcome of this meeting would determine something about their own situations as well. Richard Caldwell was already there. He had positioned himself at the front right side, near the board's table, with his associate beside him and 2 other men she didn't know. He saw James come in, and his expression did not change, which told her he had expected them to come and had been hoping they wouldn't. Thomas Reed was in the 2nd row. He saw Elizabeth. She met his eyes. She did not look away first. He did. The 5 board members settled. The chairman was a man named Aldous Marsh. She knew him from the records as a methodical man who disliked complications and liked established procedure, which made him simultaneously Caldwell's best asset and potentially their own. If the procedure argument worked, Marsh would follow it. Not because he cared about justice particularly, but because he cared about doing things in order. Marsh opened the meeting. Caldwell presented first. He was smooth, she would give him that. He understood how to present a legal argument to men who were not lawyers, how to use simple language, how to make a complex financial claim sound like common sense, how to make a land grab sound like responsible development. He laid out the commercial interest, the road project, the water rights question, the survey classification, and Thomas Reed's testimony all in one continuous argument. The way a skilled builder lays a foundation, each piece depending on the ones before it. The whole thing looking solid because it was presented as solid. Then Reed stood. He spoke for 8 minutes. He was careful. He was not mean. Exactly. He was not the man she had feared, the one who would stand up and use the platform to take out his private grievances. He was something more dangerous, a man being reasonable, a man providing what he framed as disinterested information, a man saying, "These are simply the facts I observed, and I offer them to the board in the public interest." He talked about the difficult seasons, the reduced cattle numbers, the north section lying fallow, the operating losses in the spring. Every word accurate, every word shaped. Elizabeth watched the board members' faces. Marsh was taking notes. Elias Grover, third seat on the left, the one Hayes had named, was frowning slightly. The frown was not hostile. It was the frown of a man doing arithmetic. When Reed finished and sat, Marsh looked toward James. "Mr. Walker," he said. "Your response?" Brannigan stood first. He addressed the procedure question. He was precise and swift. 6 minutes. The procedural precedent laid out in 3 specific examples. The 60-day review requirement established clearly. Marsh's pen moved. Grover leaned forward. Caldwell's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Then Brannigan introduced the Walker Declaration. He had copies made for each board member. He gave them a moment to read. Then he explained what they were reading and what it meant. And he let the silence after the explanation do its own work. Then James stood. Elizabeth had helped him prepare what he was going to say. She had spent 2 evenings helping him find the shape of it, not the legal arguments. Brannigan had those, but the human argument, the one that mattered in a room full of people who were ultimately making a decision about neighbors, about community, about what kind of county they were. He did not read from notes. He looked at the board. "I've run cattle on the Walker property for 11 years, he said. "My father ran cattle there for 20 before that. Every season has not been easy. The spring of last year was the worst in my experience, and I won't pretend otherwise, because this board has access to the records, and the records don't lie." He paused. "What the records also show is 33 years of continuous agricultural use, documented, filed, signed. The declaration you're holding is in my father's handwriting. He filed it because he believed that documented truth was stronger than convenient assumption, and I have found that to be correct every time." He looked at Caldwell. "I'm not here to argue about development," he said. "Development happens. Roads get built. That is the nature of the territory, and I don't oppose it as a principle. I oppose this specific process, which has misread a public record, moved faster than its own rules allow, and depended on an incomplete picture of my ranch's history." He looked back at the board. "I'm asking you to follow your own procedure. Take the 60 days. Read the complete record, then decide." He sat. The room was quiet. Marsh looked at the declaration, then Caldwell stood. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "the declaration is dated, but the period in question is the 14 years since the survey reclassification. The prior declaration does not speak to. It speaks to intent of use at the time of filing," Brannigan said, standing, "which is precisely what the Hatchett decision established as the relevant standard in 1879. Would the board like me to read that section into the record?" Marsh looked at Grover. Grover looked at Brannigan. "Yes," Grover said. "Read it." Caldwell sat. Brannigan read it. Elizabeth watched Elias Grover's face. She watched it, the way she had watched Hayes's face in the barn, when she first explained why it mattered. The way she had watched Isaac Morrison's face on the porch, the way she had watched James' face when he first saw his father's handwriting. The way she had learned to watch faces since she was 16 years old. Not for what they announced, but for what they couldn't help revealing. Grover's face revealed a man arriving at a conclusion. Marsh called a recess. 15 minutes. The room broke into conversation. Elizabeth stayed in her seat. Hayes, who had come in quietly and taken a seat at the back of the room without anyone asking him to, caught her eye across the space. He raised one eyebrow. She gave the smallest possible nod. He looked back at the front of the room. James leaned over. "Grover," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "He's the one." "I know. Did you plan for him?" She looked at the board table, at the third seat on the left. "I planned for the argument," she said. "Some people respond to good arguments." "And the rest?" "The rest respond to what the room feels like," she said. "Which is why the last page." He looked at her. "Read it again if you need to," she said quietly. "Not for the board. For you." He was quiet. Then Marsh came back. The board reconvened. Caldwell made his final argument, which was efficient and harder-edged than his first. The argument of a man who feels his footing shifting and is pressing harder to compensate. He challenged the precedent. He challenged the sufficiency of the declaration. He made, at the very end, the implication that the Walker Ranch's management had been recently influenced by an outside party with no experience in frontier land operations, and that the board should weigh that instability against the clarity of a sale. The room shifted. Elizabeth felt it. Several people turned toward her. She looked at the board. Marsh was about to speak when Samuel Hayes stood up from the back row. The room went quiet in a different way, the way a room goes quiet when the person standing is unexpected. Hayes was not a man who made speeches. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew that. He was a man of function, of position, of work. Seeing him on his feet in a public meeting was the equivalent of watching a mountain decide to walk somewhere. "I'd like to say something," Hayes said. Marsh looked at him. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "this is not." "I've worked for James Walker for 9 years," Hayes said. "And I've been on that ranch for 32. I knew his father. I know the north section, the south section, and every acre between them the way I know my own hands." He paused. "You just heard it said that the ranch's recent management is unstable because of an outside party." He looked at Caldwell. Then he looked at the board. "I'd like to address that." Marsh looked at the other board members. Grover nodded. "Briefly," Marsh said. "Elizabeth Carter came to the Walker Ranch 8 weeks ago," Hayes said. "She came under circumstances that most of this town witnessed firsthand." A pause. "There was not a person in the room who didn't know what he meant. What most of this town did not witness is what she's done since. She corrected the accounts. She stabilized the supply operations. She read 7 years of county land records on her own time and found the document that is sitting in front of you right now." He looked at the board. "The Walker Ranch is more stable today than it has been in 2 years. Because of her. Calling that instability is not an error. It is a deliberate misrepresentation." He sat. The room was completely still. Then, from the middle section, a woman Elizabeth did not know stood and said, "My husband works the Morrison grazing section. He told me what she did." Another man stood. "She fixed the Brewster account. Preston at the bank told me it had been wrong for months." Will stood up from the far end of the row, visibly terrified and visibly committed. "She makes the Thursday cornbread," he said. Then, realizing that was perhaps not the argument he intended, added, "She remembers everything. About everybody. She never lets anything fall." A small sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter, not quite crying. Something in between, the thing that happens when a crowd recognizes truth delivered in the wrong format and loves it anyway. Elizabeth looked at the table in front of her. She was doing the thing she did when she needed to hold herself together. She was counting. Not numbers, just the sensation of her own breathing. In, out, in. She had not expected this. She had expected to fight. She had not expected the room to fight with her. Marsh called for order. The board conferred for 12 minutes. 12 minutes that Elizabeth experienced in a way she could not have accurately described, not as individual seconds, but as a continuous state of compressed waiting, the kind where your mind is both very loud and very still at the same time. When Marsh spoke, he addressed Caldwell first. "The board finds sufficient basis in the Walker filing to require a 60-day review period before any redesignation vote can proceed." He kept his voice even. "This is consistent with the hatchet cited by the Petitioners' Council and consistent with this board's established procedure." He looked at his notes. "The review will commence immediately. Caldwell Investments is notified accordingly." Caldwell's expression did not break, but his associate stopped writing. That was how she knew. James let out a breath beside her. Brannigan was already making notes. Hayes, from the back row, made no sound whatsoever, but when Elizabeth turned around, he met her eyes and gave the same small raise of his coffee cup gesture she had learned to understand, translated now to empty hands, which was somehow the same. The room broke into noise. Thomas Reed stood and walked toward the exit without looking at anyone. He passed close to where Elizabeth was sitting. He stopped. She looked up. He stood for a moment with something on his face that she had not expected and was not sure how to name. Not quite remorse. Because remorse required a reckoning he did not look like he had finished having. But something had shifted, some recognition that had not been there at the train station, or outside the dry goods store, or in any of the moments she had spent bracing herself against his particular form of damage. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Reed." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I chose wrong. At the station, I made a quick judgment and I chose wrong." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you did." He waited. She did not say more. He nodded slowly. He walked out. She did not watch him go. James was beside her. He said nothing. She said nothing. They sat for a moment in the noise and motion of a room reconstituting itself around a changed outcome, and she allowed herself to feel it, not the triumph. Exactly, because she knew the 60 days were not a victory. They were only a door that had opened where a wall had been, and there was still the territory beyond the door to navigate. But the door was open. She had helped open it, James said quietly. "Only for her. You should probably know that I intend to ask Brannigan to draw up a permanent employment agreement." She looked at him. "Covering the household management and the accounts," he said. "With appropriate wages and a formal description of responsibilities." He paused. "So that anyone who suggests the arrangement here is unstable or informal has a legal document to contend with." She held his gaze. "That's a very practical reason to draw up an employment agreement," she said. "I'm a practical man, you are." A pause. "Is that the only reason?" she said. He looked at her. The room was loud around them. Neither of them was in it. "No," he said simply. She looked at her hands. "I'll want to review the terms," she said. "I'd expect nothing less." She looked up. And for the first time since arriving in Cedar Hollow, since the train platform, since the envelope, since the 48 hours of held breath and quiet arithmetic and careful breathing, Elizabeth Carter let herself fully, wholly smile. Not the small, careful version she had been managing. The real one. The one that had been waiting all this time for somewhere safe to land. James Walker saw it, and something in his face changed in a way that was not complicated and was not practical and was not anything except exactly what it was. They drove back to the ranch in the kind of quiet that was not empty. Hayes rode ahead with the hands. Brannigan went to send a telegraph. The road stretched out in front of them through the Colorado late afternoon, and neither of them needed to fill the silence, because some silences are not gaps. Some silences are the sound of two people sitting inside the same feeling without needing to explain it yet. When they pulled into the yard, Will was already there. He looked at their faces. He read what he saw. He said, "Did we win?" "We bought 60 days, Elizabeth said, climbing down. "Is that winning?" She thought about it. "It's a door," she said. "What we do with what's behind it is up to us. Will considered this." Then he said, "I'll make the coffee." She walked into the house. She stood for a moment in the kitchen she had reorganized, the kitchen with the straight curtains and the dry floor, and the supply system that meant they never ran out of salt and coffee at the same time. She set her shawl on the hook by the door. She put her hands flat on the work table. She let herself be here, just here. In this place that she had walked into 8 weeks ago as a stranger, and had made, one small careful act at a time, into something she could not imagine leaving. She was still standing there when James came in. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked back. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. The lamp was low, and the ranch was settling into evening around them, and outside the window, Cedar Hollow was still turning over everything that had happened and deciding what it meant. But in here, in this kitchen, everything had already been decided. Not said yet, but decided. And that was, Elizabeth Carter thought, exactly enough for tonight. The 60 days did not pass quietly. Elizabeth had not expected them to. A door opening was not the same as a battle won. And she had learned enough about Richard Caldwell in 8 weeks to know that a man who moved within 48 hours of a setback did not sit quietly through a 2-month review period. He would be working, he would be filing, adjusting, recalculating, finding the next angle of approach. The board's decision had closed one door. Caldwell would already be looking for the window. She was right. The first sign came 6 days after the meeting, when Brannigan rode back out to the ranch with a document he had found, filed at the county clerk's office, a supplemental brief from Caldwell's lawyers that argued the Hatchet precedent did not apply to mixed-use land parcels, of which the Walker North section technically qualified, because the Morrison grazing agreement created a secondary use classification that complicated the pure agricultural designation. Elizabeth read it at the kitchen table. James read it beside her. Brannigan sat across from them. "Is he right?" James said. "Partially," Brannigan said. "The mixed-use argument has some basis. It's not a strong basis, but it's enough to raise in a review period." "So we answer it," Elizabeth said. Both men looked at her. "The Morrison agreement is a grazing contract," she said. "Not a land use modification. It doesn't change the designation of the Walker property, it changes the use of Morrison land. James's property is still operating under the same classification." She looked at Brannigan. "Is that correct?" Brannigan was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that is correct. And it's the argument I would have made." He looked at her with the expression she had started to recognize, the one where he was recalibrating upward. "Did you think of this before reading the brief or after?" "During," she said. He made a note. "I'll file the response tomorrow," he said. He left before supper. James stayed at the table. "You knew he would come back," he said. "He has too much invested to stop at one setback," she said. "You've been preparing." She looked at the papers in front of her. "Since the day he drove out of the yard," she said. James was quiet. "Elizabeth," he said, "I need to ask you something." She kept her eyes on the documents. Something in his voice made the space between them feel changed. "What happens," he said carefully, "when this is over? When the 60 days end, and the review closes, and whatever decision the board makes when it's finished? What happens to you?" She put down her pen. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he stopped, started again, more slowly. "You came here because you had nowhere else to go. That was the circumstance. I offered work, and you accepted, and you've done that work, and more." He held her gaze. "But circumstances change. The employment agreement Brannigan is drawing up gives you security, but it doesn't answer the question." A pause. "I'm asking what you want, not what the situation requires. What you want." The kitchen was very quiet. She had been waiting for this question for 8 weeks. She had been rehearsing the careful, measured answer she would give, the one that kept appropriate distance, that did not presume, that acknowledged what was real, without reaching for what might only be wished. She said, "I want to stay," not the careful answer. The true one. James held her gaze. "Here," she said. "At this ranch with." She stopped. "With?" he said. She looked at him. "With the accounts," she said. "And the Thursday cornbread. And the straight curtains, a breath, and you." The word landed in the room. Neither of them moved. Then James said, "That's the answer I was hoping for." He did not reach across the table. Not yet. But he looked at her in a way that was its own kind of reaching, and she looked back, and the lamp between them burned low and steady, and outside the ranch was settling into its night rhythms, and inside this kitchen, something that had been building for 8 weeks arrived at the place it had been moving toward all along. Not finished, not spoken all the way through yet, but arrived. Hayes knocked on the kitchen doorframe exactly then. Because Hayes had the particular talent of appearing at moments that required him and disappearing from moments that didn't. And the expression on his face when he took in the scene, James on one side of the table, Elizabeth on the other. The specific quality of the air between them was the expression of a man who has been expecting something and is mildly annoyed that it took this long. "Cattle count's done," he said. "South pasture numbers are up." "Good," James said, without looking away from Elizabeth. Hayes looked between them. "I'll put it in the log," he said. He left. Elizabeth looked at the table. She was doing the careful breathing again, but a different kind this time. Not the kind that holds things in, the kind that makes room for something new. The review period wore on. Caldwell filed 2 more supplemental briefs. Brannigan answered both. Elizabeth read every document before it went out and caught one argument. Brannigan had not considered a secondary water usage filing from 11 years ago that Caldwell's team was planning to use as evidence of non-continuous agricultural use. It was in the county records, buried in a quarterly report, that most people would have passed over. Elizabeth found it because she had read everything, the way she always read everything, and she flagged it for Brannigan on a Tuesday morning with a note that said simply, "Page 43, Quarterly Water Report, 1,874. This will be their next move." Brannigan called it the best piece of anticipatory legal research he had seen from a non-lawyer in 15 years of practice. He said this to James. James said it to Elizabeth. She said, "Tell him to write to me directly. It saves time." James smiled. She saw it and then looked away, because his smile at full strength was something she was still learning to look at without losing her concentration entirely. The Morrison family held. Isaac Morrison came to the ranch on a Sunday, unannounced, 3 weeks into the review period. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee, and told James directly that his son Daniel had met with Caldwell twice more and had come home from the second meeting with a look on his face that Morrison Sr. recognized and did not approve of. "Daniel wants the money," Morrison said. "He's 29 years old, and he sees a number and he doesn't see what's behind it." James said, "What did you tell him?" Morrison said, "I told him about the Henderson land." A silence. "Did he listen?" Elizabeth asked. Morrison looked at her. "He listened when I told him what happened to the Henderson family's water access," he said. "He's 29, not stupid." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He won't sell." James let out a breath. Morrison stayed for another hour. Before he left, he stood at the door and looked at Elizabeth with the careful eyes of a man who had been watching situations unfold for 60 years and had developed a reliable sense of their eventual direction. "You planning to stay?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. He left. Hayes appeared from around the corner a moment later, having clearly been within earshot, because Hayes was always within earshot of anything that mattered. "Morrison just called you a permanent fixture," he said. "He asked if I was staying," she said. "Same thing," Hayes said. He went back to work. 3 days before the review period closed, the largest twist of the entire 60 days arrived not from Caldwell, not from the county board, not from Thomas Reed, but from a man named Wallace Preston. Preston was the banker, the man who had shared James's account information with Caldwell. He arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, without notice, driving himself, no associate, and he came to the front door rather than the yard, which was the choice of a man who was coming on personal rather than professional terms, and wanted that distinction to be visible. Elizabeth answered the door. Preston was perhaps 60, white-haired, carrying the particular posture of a man who has done something he cannot stop knowing about, and has arrived at the point where the knowing is heavier than the confession will be. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Preston, is James Walker available?" "He's in the barn," she said. "Would you like to come in while I get him?" She settled him at the table. She went to the barn. She told James quietly what she saw in Preston's face. James looked toward the house. "What do you think he wants?" he said. "I think he wants to tell you something he should have told you a long time ago," she said. "And I think it might matter for the review." James came in. He sat across from Preston. Elizabeth made coffee and stayed in the room because James did not ask her to leave, which she understood as its own kind of statement. Preston held his cup. He said, "I need to tell you something about the Caldwell account." James was still. "Specifically about the information that Caldwell obtained regarding your outstanding debts," Preston said. "I need to tell you how he obtained it." "I know how he obtained it," James said. His voice was level, carefully level. Preston looked up. "Through you," James said. Preston did not deny it. "He came to me 6 months ago," Preston said. "He told me he was interested in acquiring the Walker property as a development investment, and that he needed to understand the financial landscape. He made it sound like," he stopped, "he made it sound like something it wasn't. And I was not careful enough about what I shared." James said nothing. "I've been in this county for 30 years, Preston said. "I've done business with your family for 22 of them. Your father opened his first account with my bank." He looked at the table. "I made an error, a significant error, and I am aware that saying so does not undo the damage it caused." "No," James said, "it doesn't." Another silence. "Why are you here now?" James said. Preston reached into his coat. He produced a document. He set it on the table. "Caldwell filed the supplemental brief about the mixed-use classification 3 weeks ago," he said. "His lawyers obtained a copy of the quarterly water report from 1874 through a county records request. They plan to use it at the review hearing." He paused. "I know this because one of Caldwell's associates mentioned it to me last week, still under the assumption that I was providing information." He looked at James. "I am not providing information. I came here to tell you what they plan to do." Elizabeth looked at the document. She had already flagged this. She had already told Brannigan. But the fact that Preston was here saying this meant something different from the legal question. It meant that Caldwell's network was not as solid as it appeared. It meant that the men he believed were his were making different calculations. She said, "Mr. Preston." He looked at her. "Does Caldwell know you're here?" "No. When you go back to Cedar Hollow, he will find out eventually." Preston was quiet. "Yes," he said, "and you came anyway." "Yes." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. "Not hostility." Genuine question. The kind she asked when she needed to understand something and had no time to work around to it. Preston looked at James. "Because I've been in this county for 30 years, he said again. "And when I'm gone, the things I did and didn't do will be what remains." He paused. "I can't undo the information I shared, but I can decide what I do next." James looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you for coming." Preston stood. He left without finishing his coffee. Elizabeth sat down. James sat down across from her. He said, "You already knew about the 1874 report." "Yes," you told Brannigan. "Yes. So Preston's information doesn't change the legal situation." "No," she said, "but it changes something else." He looked at her. "Caldwell built this on the assumption that the people around you were his," she said. Preston read. "Whoever else he approached. He built a structure that depended on that." She looked at the door. Preston had walked out. "That structure is coming apart. Not because we forced it. Because the people in it are making different decisions." James was quiet. "That's what honesty does," she said. Eventually, he looked at her. Eventually, he repeated. "It's slower than I'd like," she admitted. He almost smiled. "You'd like everything faster than it happens," he said. "I'd like the things that are right to happen at the speed they deserve," she said. "Which is faster than they usually do." He did laugh, then a real one, quiet. The kind he kept for the kitchen and not the yard. And she felt the warmth of it the same way. She felt the warmth of the lamp, evenly, without flinching. The review hearing was held on a Thursday. Not Thursday, the cornbread day. Thursday, the resolution day, which was a coincidence, or wasn't, depending on how you felt about the way things arranged themselves when you weren't looking. Cedar Hollow turned out for it the way it had turned out for the board meeting, but differently. The first meeting had the quality of a spectacle, people coming to watch something happen. This one had the quality of a reckoning, people coming because they understood the outcome would tell them something about the kind of place they lived in and the kind of people they were. Brannigan was prepared. He was better than prepared. He had the 1,874 report rebuttal ready before Caldwell's lawyers even raised it, which produced a visible ripple of surprise on Caldwell's side of the table and a visible effort to conceal that surprise, which told the board more than the legal argument itself did. The Walker Declaration stood. The mixed-use argument failed on the specific language of the Morrison grazing agreement. Elizabeth's reading had been correct. The contract did not modify the Walker property's designation. Preston did not testify. He did not need to, but he sat in the room, in the third row, in plain sight, and Caldwell saw him there. And whatever calculation Caldwell ran, based on that visibility, produced an effect she could see from across the room in the slight tightening around Caldwell's mouth, and the single look he directed at Preston, that Preston received without flinching and without looking away. Thomas Reed was not there. She noticed that. She noticed it without attaching too much to it. It was a fact, not a resolution, and she had learned the difference between the two. Elias Grover asked the decisive question. He addressed it to Brannigan, but he looked at Elizabeth when he asked it, which she did not think was accidental. The continuous agricultural use claim, he said. The record shows 2 seasons of reduced operation. How does the petitioner address the argument that the reduced seasons constitute a gap in the continuous use requirement? Brannigan answered. But Elizabeth had written the answer. She had written it at 2 a.m, 10 days earlier, when she was still sitting at the table after Hay had gone to sleep and the lamp was burning low, and she had found the specific language in a 1,881 Land Commission ruling that addressed reduced capacity seasons as distinct from abandoned use, distinctions so precise and so directly applicable that when she found it, she sat for a full minute doing nothing but breathing. Brannigan read the ruling into the record. Grover made a note. Marsh called the recess. James sat beside her. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. They sat in the noise of the room and waited in the particular silence they had developed between them, the silence that did not require filling, that had its own texture and its own meaning. That was the silence of 2 people who had been in the same fight long enough that the fight had become part of how they knew each other. The board came back. Marsh spoke. The board finds insufficient basis for commercial redesignation of the Walker North Water access. His voice was even. Procedural. The voice of a man reading a decision, not making one, because the decision had been made in the room, behind the door. The agricultural use designation is confirmed. The Caldwell petition is denied. The room was not quiet. It was immediately, completely, fully not quiet. Elizabeth sat for a moment inside the noise. She felt James's hand find hers under the table. She did not look at him. She held on. That was all. She held on and let the noise of Cedar Hollow wash over her and let herself be, for one full unguarded moment, exactly as happy as she was. Caldwell left without speaking to anyone. His associate followed. The room turned away. Rooms turn after a verdict, the reconstitution, the conversation, the hands being shaken, and the voices overlapping, and the specific human sound of a group of people processing something together. Hayes pushed through to where she was standing. He looked at her. He said, "Well." She said, "Well." He said, "You know this isn't actually the end of it. He'll look for another angle." "Probably," she said. "You're not worried." "I'm worried," she said. "I'm also very good at dealing with things I'm worried about." Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something he had never done in the 10 weeks she had been at the Walker Ranch. He extended his hand. She shook it. He said, "You earned this place." She said, "So did you." He looked slightly startled. Then he turned and went to talk to Morrison, who had been in the back row, and who shook Hayes's hand with the grip of a man who has been waiting for a particular outcome and finds it, feels exactly as he hoped. Will appeared at her elbow. "I'm going to make the coffee tonight," he said. "You're not allowed to cook anything." "Will, no," he said firmly. "Absolutely not. You sit down," he pointed at a chair. "Sit." She sat. She was laughing. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed at full volume without catching it first. James found her there. He stood in front of her. The room was still busy around them, but it had rearranged itself, the way rooms do when there are two people in them who are the center of something, and everyone else has wordlessly agreed to give that something space. "Come outside," he said. She went outside with him. The air was cold in the way Colorado air in late autumn is cold, clean, and direct, without apology, the kind of cold that makes you feel that your edges are well defined, that you know exactly where you end and the world begins. James stood beside her. He looked at the mountains. She looked at the mountains. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what I want to say for 3 weeks." She kept her eyes on the mountains, and she said, "And I keep finding that the thing I want to say is very simple," he said. "Which is inconvenient, because I've been rehearsing something more elaborate." "Say the simple thing," she said. He turned to face her. She turned to face him. "You are not someone who needed saving," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You were never someone who needed saving. You walked off that train platform under your own power, and you have been under your own power every day since." He paused. "But I would very much like to be the person standing next to you while you go." She looked at him. "While I go where?" she said. "Wherever you're going," he said. Which, based on the last 10 weeks, is likely to be faster and further than most people expect. She held his gaze. "That's still not the simple thing," she said. He took a breath. "Stay," he said. "Not because of the employment agreement. Not because of the ranch or the accounts or the Thursday cornbread." He looked at her directly. "Stay because I don't want to sit across that table from anyone else. Stay because this place has been a house for 4 years, and since you've been in it, it's been a home again." He paused. "Stay because you're mine, and I think I might be yours. And I think we've both known that, for longer than either of us has been willing to say." Elizabeth Carter stood in the cold Colorado air outside the Cedar Hollow meeting hall. She thought about a train platform, a return ticket she refused to take, a suitcase containing almost nothing, a Bible and 3 letters, and one small, stubborn, specific belief that there was a life somewhere worth building and that she was capable of building it. She thought about straight curtains and balanced ledgers and Thursday cornbread and a man who looked at her on a crowded platform, not as a spectacle, but as a person. She thought about walls and homes and the distance between the two. She looked at James Walker. She said, "The employment agreement needs to include a review clause." He blinked. "For the wages," she said, "based on performance." "Elizabeth, I'm serious. I've been significantly underpaid for the accounting work alone, and we both know it." He stared at her, then he started to smile. "We can negotiate," he said. "We will negotiate," she said. "I'm very good at it." "I know," he said. "I've watched you negotiate with county board presidents." "I'm not optimistic about my position." She looked at him. The smile she gave him was the real one, the one without caution. "Good," she said. He reached out. He took her hand the way he had taken it under the table. Not a performance, not a statement, just a reaching, a contact, the specific gravity of one person toward another, after a long time of circling. She let him hold it. She held back, and in Cedar Hollow, Colorado territory, in the autumn of 1885, under a sky that stretched from here to the edge of what a person could imagine, the woman the town had rejected, and the cowboy who had seen her clearly from the beginning, stood outside, in the cold, and held on to each other. Not because she needed him, not because he saved her, but because two people who have fought the same fight side by side, who have sat across the same table through the same long nights, who have learned the exact shape of each other's courage and the exact sound of each other's silence. Those two people do not walk away from each other when the fight is over. They walk forward together. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Hollow told the story the way small towns tell stories imperfectly, with elaborations, with the specific mythology that attaches to events when the people involved are still present and visible, and the town is still deciding what to make of them. They told it about the woman who stepped off the train with nothing and built something out of it. They told it about the lawyer from Denver and the county board and the 60 days. They told it about Hayes standing up in a public meeting and the words he said, and the way the room went quiet to receive them. They told it about the banker who drove out to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon. They told it about Thomas Reed, who left town 4 months later quietly, without incident, and was not talked about much after that, because the story of him had become the least interesting part of the larger story. They told it about James Walker, who rode into Cedar Hollow the following spring, with Elizabeth beside him in the wagon, and who stopped at the dry goods store, and who said, to Mrs. Calloway and everyone else within earshot, in a voice that carried because he intended it to, "I'd like you to meet my wife." The ranch thrived, not easily. Nothing Colorado territory thrived easily, and there were seasons that required the same fierce practical love that had characterized the first 10 weeks. There were hard winters and difficult cattle markets, and a summer 2 years later when the North Creek ran low and everyone held their breath and watched the water and did the tick. But the accounts balanced, the records were impeccable. The Thursday cornbread was always on the table. And when people in Cedar Hollow talked about the Walker Ranch in the years that followed, about how it had survived what should have broken it, about how a woman with a suitcase and a declined return ticket had walked into a failing operation and rebuilt it from the inside out, they always ended the story the same way. They said, she was never someone who needed saving. She was someone worth standing beside. And he was the only man in Cedar Hollow who knew the difference. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything.